So our luncheon speaker today is Dr. William Alley, who is Director of the Science and Technology for the National Groundwater Association. He served as Chief Office of Groundwater for the U.S. Geological Survey for almost 2 decades. Dr. Alley has published over 100 scientific publications and received numerous awards for his work, including the meritorious Presidential Rank Award. He holds a BS in Geological Engineering from the Colorado School of Mines, an MS from Stanford University, and a PhD from Johns Hopkins. Dr. Alley and his wife Rosemary recently completed a general science book, High and Dry, on the world's groundwater, to be published early in 2017 by the Yale University Press. It's my pleasure to give you Dr. William Alley.
Hey, thanks, George. Everybody can hear me? Okay, so I actually have an engineering degree, so that's a good thing. Although you wouldn't want me to design any buildings, I can tell you that right now. Coming to this meeting kind of reminded me of a story about 3 people who were coming in a plane to Washington, D.C. It was a small single prop. It was a young woman who was a backpacker and a priest and the smartest man in the world. At least that was what he told the other passengers anyway. And the plane started to have some problems, and the captain said, you know, I'm going to go try to land this plane, but you really ought to jump out in parachutes. And so the 3 of them looked, and they looked back, and there were only 2 parachutes. So the smartest man in the world said, I've got to live. He was on his way to the National Academy meeting. And so he grabbed one of them, and he jumped out of the plane. And so the priest said to the young woman, he said, you know, you've got a lot of life to you. You can go ahead and have the final parachute. And she said, that's okay, Father. The smartest man in the world just jumped out of the plane with my backpack on. So just like there's all kinds of different levels of intelligence, I'm going to tie this to the talk here, there are many faces to groundwater depletion. So I'm going to talk about that a little bit. Okay, and basically here's my outline. So we're going to look at groundwater depletion from a number of different scales, connections to climate, and then groundwater visibility. I'll tell you what that means shortly. So as a poster child, we all hear about the High Plains Aquifer and the Central Valley. Those seem to be the 2 focus points. But there are a lot of other major aquifer systems around the United States. One of them is the Mississippi Embayment, which was already mentioned today at one point. And I think does this point? Yeah. Okay, so it's up here. And it's really 2 major aquifers, an alluvial aquifer and then a confined aquifer known as the Middle Claiborne Aquifer. And this is the 3rd most pumped groundwater system in the United States after the High Plains, which is well in number 1 in the Central Valley, pretty close to the Central Valley. Then these show 2 maps. So I mentioned there were 2 aquifers. There's this alluvial aquifer system, which is principally used for agriculture. And then there's a confined aquifer system, which is used by about 5 million people, I believe, for their public water supply. And this shows water level declines. And you can see the brown areas are the areas where there's really a lot of groundwater level decline. And the one on your left here is the outline. You can see the outline of the aquifer is the alluvial aquifer. And the one on the right is the confined aquifer. So the first thing you can see there is there's a lot more water level decline in the confined aquifer than the unconfined aquifer. Taking that story a little bit further, this is a graph of the change in groundwater storage through time. And the blue line is the alluvial aquifer. And down with kind of the other lines is the confined aquifer. Okay, so I just told you all the water level decline, a lot of it was in the confined aquifers, but the storage depletion is really in the alluvial aquifer. Alluvial aquifers lost about 1/4 of its pre-development volume. And interestingly enough, you'll notice that the total is less than the Mississippi River Valley alluvial aquifer. Well, the reason for that is because some of that water is coming from confined units that aren't included in this particular graph. If we look at just a simple water balance for the aquifer, at the top is the pre-development, just kind of showing where the flow of water is going. You can see the mass it's pulling out. This is in acre-feet per year. So under development, it's pulling out 19 million acre-feet per year. So this is a huge development of groundwater. But I think if you just compare the top and the bottom in terms of, for example, this alluvial aquifer used to primarily is to overall discharge the streams. Now it's pulling water from the streams. You can see what the net recharge. So this shows just the phenomenal effect that agriculture or development can have on the water budget of a groundwater system. Okay, let's look at a second one. This is the Columbia Plateau in the states of Washington, Oregon, and Idaho. Nice picture of it there. This is about 5% of the irrigated land in the United States is actually in this large basaltic plain. And it's basically groundwater is coming from, most of it's coming from basalts, but also there's some overlying overburden type aquifers that are used very shallow. And we'll just look at the depletion. I think Lenny Conocal showed earlier that from pre-development to today, it's actually picked up water because there's a lot of surface water irrigation. So this is somewhat analogous to this, a little different than the Central Valley, but there's a lot of surface water irrigation historically and groundwater irrigation. And so if you start to look at the kind of what the water level declines look like, you can see this patchwork between areas in blue where you have water level increases of over 100 feet in areas, even over 200, and you have areas where there are, this is a yellow, and you have areas where there are groundwater depletion. So right next to one another, this patchwork. And this aquifer system is actually would be considered very stressed in the sense that there's not a lot of potential for future development because a lot of concern about essentially the interaction between the surface water and the groundwater and the fact that there are a lot of in-stream flow needs for endangered species. And it's not just the flow, it's the temperature of the water and to some degree the water quality that's of concern. So it gets down, groundwater depletion actually gets down to this scale. Now, I don't know if you can see it or not, but these are contours. This is a stream. These things here are trout. Okay, and this is your different temperatures. So this is showing these trout all trying to get into this particular area that has the right temperature. Now it turns out trout, the big fish not only eat the little fish, but they also crowd them out. So if you look at this, you can see actually the bigger fish kind of hogging the good areas where the temperature's right. But the point is the temperature is a very important factor. So the groundwater depletion that may occur in a particular local area may affect thermal refugia for fish, in this case during the summertime. And so just to show you the scaling down that groundwater depletion, we already heard a little bit about that from the final speaker this morning. So I think okay. And then the question is, let's just look at it from a broad scale. So is the Mississippi embayment, which I showed you first, or is the Columbia Plateau more stressed? Okay, I would argue that it's a little hard to tell. Obviously, there's a lot more pumping that's happening from the Mississippi embayment than from the Columbia Plateau, but the Mississippi embayment actually has the Mississippi River there, so there is the potential for recharge, surface water availability, whereas the Columbia Plateau, really, there's fewer opportunities actually to deal with the situation. So if you just look at them from very simple these are some indicators that have been developed over time. What you find out is that this Columbia doesn't look so stressed as the Mississippi embayment. So what you need to do is think about the way, if you always want to think something good about your own models, the best way to do it is to look at the next broadest scale up, because that way you find out if you're a riparian person, you want to look at what these regional models do, because you can see that they don't know what they're doing. They don't know what they're talking about. If you're a regional modeler, then you look at what these global modelers are doing. You say they don't know what they're talking about. Well, the truth is that what the global models will tell the other ones is that, well, we can give you a broader perspective. Granted, it's painted with a broad brush, but we can give you a broader perspective. But I think the key point is that we need information at multiple scales for any of this. So I think these two examples illustrate a couple points. First of all, in thinking about groundwater depletion, we need to think about groundwater as a three-dimensional system. We need to do analyses at multiple scales. We have a situation where we have multiple cones of depression juxtaposed with areas of little or no storage depletion or even storage accretion, if you will. We don't talk about it as much in this depletion, but really there's a hugely different response between confined and unconfined aquifers that we have to think about. And it's a lot harder to characterize these confined aquifers sometimes without getting the more detailed information. 70% of the world's groundwater is used for agriculture. 90% of the consumptive use of groundwater is for agriculture. So if you want to know about groundwater depletion, you got to get the irrigated agricultural systems right. So we need to understand, and they're very complicated, and they're constantly changing in terms of where the water is going. And there are legal and regulatory constraints. The Columbia Plateau is a good example that really have major impacts on groundwater depletion, whether you're in a stress condition or not. Likewise, effects on environmental flows. And then, of course, we've already mentioned a number of times the availability of infrastructure and alternate water sources, and I'll show you another example here shortly on that factor. So just from these two examples, I think you can see these major points here. So the next thing, thinking about scale, is that depletion of the total volume of a groundwater system is not really possible. But also beyond that, really well before you do that, you have other effects which start to come into play. We heard about land subsidence. When that's the case here in Houston. So Houston used to be completely dependent on groundwater, but they have up to 10 feet of land subsidence sitting right on the coast. So they've made a very expensive transition to surface water overall. Heard about the Edwards Aquifer, this is Comal Springs, where a few feet of water level change can affect the flow of the spring and affect endangered species. Two others not yet mentioned, the San Pedro Basin here in Arizona is a national riparian area. I'll mention it in just a little more detail in a second. But a very small percentage of water has been used, but there are major impacts on riparian systems in the San Pedro. And then the Republican River Basin, which is, the states have been to the Supreme Court a couple times on this. About 3 to 5% of the volume of groundwater and storage in the Republican Basin has been depleted, yet they've gone to the Supreme Court and basically had to put a moratorium on pumping. And the states of Colorado and Nebraska each have actually built a pipeline, huge pipes that go from areas where there's sort of the sweet zone of groundwater, and they're pumping groundwater and putting it into the Republican River to meet their compact requirements for downstream Kansas. One thing Jim didn't tell you is don't ever get on the other side, wrong side of Kansas in a water zone. I think Colorado and Nebraska know that. Okay. So why is that? Well, if you look at a typical system with a partially penetrating stream, you have this large groundwater system, but really you can't pull the water off the bottom and not have something happen up top. So basically, you have very small changes in volume can have these big impacts on surface water systems. So there's various different types of information that are available for different issues. For surface water, groundwater, things that matter are gradients, saturated thickness, land subsidence, water levels, water quality, flow systems, pumping costs in terms of hydraulic lifts and so forth. So this is a wide range of groundwater. We actually had this was the example already shown today about the Santa Cruz River south of Tucson, where the pumping is lowered to water level 100 feet, affecting the riparian vegetation. I don't know if it was mentioned, but that rock is the same rock in both pictures. Okay? But there are other examples. We heard about groundwater. This little fish here caused another Supreme Court decision. It's the Devil's Hole pupfish. Basically, people had to stop pumping because they were agricultural development around the Devil's Hole in Nevada was lowering the water level below the shelf at which these fish survived. So it's a classic case, actually, of reserved water rights in U.S. court history. So I guess the real question is, how do we combine all these various types of data to really address and provide a complete picture of groundwater depletion? It doesn't come from any one particular type of approach. This was already mentioned too. I think, Bridget, you brought this up. The Kang and Jackson study, which caused quite a bit of stir in California. And this is a quote from that. This is, by the way, is a national PNAS publication. And in this quote, in the Central Valley alone, fresh groundwater volumes can be increased almost threefold. And you can read the rest of it if we extend the depths to 3,000 meters. Well, they had an interesting story to tell there, which is that there is fresher groundwater deeper than people might have thought, but that leads to questions about what are known as exempt. Do you inject waste? Where do you inject waste? Do you inject it into saline water, which might have this fresh water? So there are a lot of issues related to aquifer exemptions, but it was completely misleading in terms of how much water is available. And this is one of the big challenges. A lot of, particularly Texas and New Mexico, are very interested in using the vast volumes of saline brackish groundwater that exist within the state. But it's not a disconnected system typically. If it is a disconnected system, then you're mining water. If it's not a disconnected system, then you've got to worry about the impacts. And as was mentioned, can you really pull water? Where can you pull water and not have a continuing effect on not only land subsidence, but also water quality? Okay, so that's spatial scale. So I want to talk about temporal scales and contrast here the human time scale versus the hydrologic. And these are just the average residence time in the different types of hydrologic compartments. So groundwater's out here, average is about 1,000 years, but it's ranges from maybe days to a million years or more. So it's a wide range. But the point is, it's usually larger than either multiple generations. Our current groundwater policy horizons, here's your typical government term, here's your politician attention span over here. So basically, the human scale that we think about time and the hydrologic time scale, and this has already come up a couple times today, are quite different. And that's particularly when it comes to issues like capture, where you do have this effect that happens over a long time. And I think I have an example. Yeah, okay. So this is the Colorado Plateau. The idea was there's Flagstaff. They were looking at pumping near Lip, and they were concerned with what's going to happen to these two creeks here, Clear Creek and Chevelon Creek. And this is a modeling study. So they were looking at a 50-year simulation, and then they stopped the withdrawals. And this is a streamflow capture. So they were pumping about 9 cubic feet per second. So as you can see, that's a lot larger than the amount they were capturing. But the interesting thing is that you can see, and if both creeks were affected, is that gradually you're getting more and more capture with time over this. But then when you turn off the pumps, at least according to the simulation, basically the peak effect or the peak capture of water from these streams is a couple decades, 2 or 3 decades from when you stop the pumps. So the point is that you really need to make the decisions a lot earlier in groundwater systems than we are today in terms of trying to avoid these kinds of effects. Okay, let's look at the San Pedro. So this is Sierra Vista. It's a beautiful area. This is the San Pedro here. It's the nation's first national riparian area. The concern is that pumping here in Sierra Vista and at Fort Huachuca is affecting this riparian system. And as I mentioned, they've only pumped like 1 or 2% of the volume of water in the aquifer before they started to have concerns about essentially drying up the stream during certain parts of the year. So there, you have to kind of adapt your management strategy to the system. So the point is that they have this very large cone of depression that's working its way towards the San Pedro River. But meanwhile, they're affecting the river with just the front end of that cone of depression, if you will. So they've had to, they tried to manage the cone of depression or manage the longer-term system under one scenario. But at the same time, they need to try to do something about not drying up the river in the immediate time frame. And so what they have is they've developed this situation where they have these artificial detention ponds and recycled water from Sierra Vista, and they're recharging the flow of this river. They've done a lot of study to find out where that would be most effective in terms of trying to keep that river flowing. You don't want the river to dry up. Okay, so now turning to climate a little bit, this is a definition we actually use in NGWA for resilience. So groundwater systems are always pointed to as as a climate resilient system. That's what we turn to when it gets dry and when we run out of water. And you have to really kind of, a couple things here about, you need to define a time frame, et cetera there. But the question is, how resilient is groundwater? Okay, and this is the Central Valley, already shown today a couple times, I think. So groundwater storage decline, okay, and this is surface water deliveries, which vary between whether you're in a wet or dry. So when you're dry time, the surface water deliveries go down, so do the groundwater levels. But the point is that they go back up, but they never really recover to where they were. So this is not a system that's being operated as groundwater as a resilient system, I would say. And there are others, there are many others. And the problem is that when it starts to rain, we all forget about the droughts that are impending, and we don't really account for the fact that we're going to start pumping more groundwater when we get into dry periods. So I would say, in terms of trying to drought-proof groundwater, we need to actually pay more attention to the way surface water hydrologists think about things, which is to sort of run scenarios of different climate projections and see what happens. And so we need to do that with groundwater. We need to raise awareness about maintaining groundwater as a resource. And it obviously points to the potential, which we've talked about a number of times today, for managed aquifer recharge. But clearly, we're stuck with the laws for the most part, but we need regulations and incentives that encourage use of surface water during wet periods. And the operative word here, I think, is prepare for increased groundwater use during droughts. So to look at resilient groundwater systems in a little more realistic fashion. And this is an example actually from work that Bridget Scanlon's done. I think she showed part of this. But already mentioned today are these active management areas in Arizona, where they passed this law in 1980. And as part of that law, they have certain goals they're trying to meet by 2025, actually. But they have the Central Arizona project. The deal they got was they got the Central Arizona project when they passed the groundwater law. And so you hear a lot in the news about Texas and California for sure in the latest drought, but Arizona has also faced a significant drought in the past decade or so. And so this is interesting. They looked at groundwater level anomalies from 1980 to 2010 and beyond. And these are these active management areas. And so you can see they either brought the water up or they've stabilized it over that period of time. Whereas the other parts of Arizona, which are not so lucky to have surface water and Central Arizona project water, and which basically have a competition to drill to the bottom of the aquifer going on. And you can see that, so Wilcox here, out in the eastern part of the state, San Simon, Gila Bend, these have gone the other direction. So this, I think, is an excellent example of the potential for sort of planning ahead and managed aquifer recharge, where you have the surface water or where you have some source of water to make a whole different story here. This would be a entirely different story without the Arizona Management Act in those active management areas. Okay, final topic quickly. So the National Groundwater Association and the American Water Resource Association actually we've started this groundwater visibility initiative. We had a workshop on it. But when you think about groundwater, we need to make it more visible. I think everybody agrees to that. And for a number of ways, because of connections to surface water, it's linked to climate variability and change. Groundwater is tends to be ignored when we're thinking about policies for agriculture or land use or energy, but it needs to be very much part of the thinking of those other sectors, if you will. We need to convey the importance of monitoring the status and trends of groundwater, both water quantity and water quality, and that requires educating people about why you should care. And there's another side of visibility, and that is that there are a lot of people involved in groundwater. It's not like surface water where you have fewer people involved. There's a lot of people involved in using groundwater. And so you have this gigantic problem of sort of groundwater governance and getting people to collaborate and work together towards solving problems. And so part of that is a visibility of groundwater information and management, so people can see what's going on and be part of it. So visibility takes a number of different areas. We had a workshop. We have a summary of that. If you just do Google on Groundwater Visibility Initiative, and the reports on either the NGWA or the AWRA website. So that's one aspect of visibility. Then I can, since I'm here, I can give a plug. So my wife is a non-scientist, and I've written a book actually, which is coming out, and it actually showed up in Amazon, but it's coming out in February 2017 on the world's meeting the challenges of the world's growing dependence on groundwater. And so my wife's goal was to make this book read like a novel instead of a USGS circular. That was easy for her, hard for me. And we also wanted to make it a world thing, because really, as we pointed out today in Jay's talk and others, the groundwater is a world issue. And so we need to have a better sort of global perspective on the problem. So that is the end of my talk. Thank you. Time for questions, or
Yes.
go back to conversation?
No, we have time for questions.
Okay.
Just a quick one, Bill. Can you tell us a little more about the National Groundwater Association? Is this a professional society? Is it an advocacy to governments? What are your objectives?
Okay. It's a very unusual organization. It's a combination of a trade association for essentially well drillers and pump manufacturers, et cetera, and it's a professional association for scientists and engineers involved in groundwater. So we have about 11,000 members. We publish a couple journals, groundwater and groundwater monitoring and remediation. We have several conferences, a number of conferences and training things we have. So so we have a large portfolio, if you will, of training, and we have people who we try to provide advice on policies, et cetera, related to groundwater. It's headquartered in Westerville, Ohio. I happen to live in California, but the organization itself is in Ohio. Bridget.
In Texas,
Bridget, un momento.
In Texas, they estimate groundwater storage, total estimated recoverable storage, and then which is just the groundwater in the pore space for both confined and unconfined aquifers, and then they assume they can produce 25 to 75% of that storage. What are your thoughts on reserve estimation and these sorts of things? And has the USGS done studies on those?
I don't know about USGS, but I've seen a recent report from the George Bush Economics Center, which took that number and ran with it, and basically said Texas does not have a water problem. I think there's a way over it. They have to do that because it goes back to the, as I understand it, it goes back to the laws in the early 2000, where the state has to propose this, how much water do we have? But in my mind, I don't think that's really very relevant.
What happens when a confined aquifer becomes unconfined? You know.
It turns into a unconfined aquifer, yeah. Yeah.
But I mean, do you get, are there many studies where that has happened or not happened?
It happens a little bit in the upper Midwest, I believe, where they've actually had some turn into unconfined. And the thing that gets you there is not just the water level decline, but the chemistry. So all of a sudden you have this confined system and you're introducing all this oxygen into it. And that's just the kind of thing that arsenic and other trace elements like to get off the iron and back into the water. So there are a few places where that experiment's going on, but I think in particular in confined aquifers, to think that you can develop 25 to 75% of the water in storage is really crazy.
Kirk Hatfield from University of Florida. Bill, I liked your introduction of resiliency into the concept of groundwater systems or groundwater surface water systems. I kind of liken them to systems that have adaptive capacity. And a good example is that of a bank account. If you have a bank account and an event happens, you have enough money in your account to take care of the household. And of course, you got to replenish that bank account afterwards. Otherwise, the next event that happens, you have nothing there. So the bank account's an adaptive capacity. The groundwater system's kind of an interesting bank account, if you will, or a means of cultivating adaptive capacity. With the previous talks that talked about subsidence, you get this irreversible loss of utility of that aquifer. So I think where you see resilience talked about today is primarily about these short-term events or these intense events. These long-term events are going to really require us to think and cultivate a interest public-wise for support. How do you think we're going to, how would you suggest that we get our politicians to think about these problems in the long term, to build that resilience, so to speak?
Yeah, that's a good question. So let me first phrase it with a question to the audience. How many times has President Obama mentioned the word aquifer or groundwater? Does anybody know the answer to that? 11. That's more than any other president, so he holds the record, but it's all related to one subject. Can anybody guess what that subject is? Fracking. That's right. So fracking's caught the attention. I mean, that's a good question. How do you get people involved until it's after it's too late? I think, you know, there's some experiences in Kansas, maybe things to be learned from Kansas, where they're trying to get people involved in addressing the issue. California, right at this point in time, I guess, is going through the biggest experiment in terms of trying to see what happens when you try to build sort of a bottoms-up approach to groundwater management. And we're still in the early stages of seeing how that works or not. My own experience from looking at actually a lot of cases around the world is that you actually need top-down management doesn't work because people cheat, basically. Hydrologic insubordination, we can call it. They all go out and they drill wells and so on. Bottoms up doesn't work by itself. So you have to have sort of this pressure from the outside. And in California, there is a pressure in the sense that if the local management districts don't follow the rules and set up a sustainability agency and put their plans in place and make them realistic, the State Water Control Board can actually step in, supposedly. Now, how that happens, whether it happens or not, how tough they're going to be remains to be seen. But you need that combination, and then in combination with that, kind of an education process, a big, huge education process, which is we need to get groundwater into our schools and get people learning from the very beginning about the importance of it as a resource. Lenny.
Lenny Conacow. Bill, the U.S. has a national policy to require the use of ethanol in fuels, and that demand for ethanol is met largely by growing corn, and much of the corn is irrigated, and much of that irrigation is with groundwater, and some of that groundwater is pumped from aquifers that are being depleted. So I guess my question is, do you think the economic and environmental costs of pumping all that groundwater has been adequately considered in setting this policy? And should it be? Does it make a difference?
That's I think that's a key example of what I mean by getting groundwater into agricultural and energy policies, basically. Because I don't think it was thought of it at all. And I also don't think they thought about the contamination part of that side of that, the amount of fertilizer and pesticides and so forth that are going to be used on those fields and what impact that's going to have. So I think that's a classic case of not thinking about groundwater when you're thinking about agricultural and energy policy. And interestingly enough, related to that is MTBE, which is what was added to gasoline before ethanol. And they never thought about groundwater there either. They just were thinking about air pollution and getting rid of the lead, which is a good thing to do. But they never thought about the fact that you have this very persistent compound that stinks, so people are going to detect it. And it was never thought about. The groundwater was never thought about.
All right, I think We appreciate your presentation.